Welcome to the second of the series, joint webinar series from three joint EU for Health projects. These three EU for Health projects are I for Kids for Rare, Orvadev for Kids, and Decode. Together, all of these projects focus on pediatric and orphan device development, and jointly we're doing a webinar series. This is the second one in this series. Today, we're going to talk about regulatory science and mostly regulatory proceedings and how to help in regulatory planning to get an orphan device or pediatric device to the market. For today, as such, we have invited, I think, three great speakers. The first one, Rich Holborow, will tell us about the regulatory landscape for pediatric and orphan devices. Then the second speaker, Tom Melvin, will tell us about the practical aspects and the tips and tricks that we can apply to, but also aspects such as orphan device status. And the third speaker, Brian, will tell us about how he has actually done this in his company and will tell us about what were his learnings from actually doing it in practice. Throughout the webinar, we'll see three short presentations as such. The first one all of them will be 10 to 15 minutes. And at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. As such, throughout the presentations, feel free to already start putting questions in the chat. Then we can discuss them at the very end with the panel session. After this short introduction, I'm happy to present Rich Holborow that will join us in discussing the regulatory landscape. And with that, thank you so much for your presentation and good luck in presenting.
Great, thank you, Annalene. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about the notified body considerations. So I'm just going to share my screen now for you. Apologies. Here we go. Hopefully that's all showing for you now. Great. So yeah, it's a great opportunity to be here. And I know when Annalene wrote to me some time ago about being involved in the Decode project and attending the workshop, it was something that certainly, as a former physiologist working in the healthcare system, see the importance of particularly maintaining availability of medical devices in particularly orphan and pediatrics for this consideration. So today I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of what our consideration is in the landscape in terms of how we qualify or consider devices as orphan devices in the context and considerations that we have to think about as a notified body. And for those that may not know, notified bodies ultimately issue the certificates for medical devices to be placed on the market. We're not effectively regulators in the sense that we're not government bodies. We're private entities that work or are designated by the governments themselves, the European Union, in order to be able to facilitate this activity. And it's something that is particularly burdensome to be a notified body, and we are heavily scrutinized for the competency that we have in our establishments. So with that, let me just give you a little bit of framework that may need to be understood in the context of the medical device regulation. And really, the medical device regulation applies to all medical devices that are placed on the EU market. And there is no specific provisions within this regulation at the moment that call out for anything specific for orphan or pediatric devices. Very much is a device is a device in the eyes of the law, whether that's a low-risk scalpel that might be used or a dental tool used by a dentist right through to a hip implant. All considerations are medical devices. But the medical device regulation does consider the level of proportionality, and that proportionality is there to consider about the compliance requirements. So, for example, we're in a class risk or risk-based classification system, which ultimately means that something that is a low-risk device versus a high-risk device. A low-risk device should have effectively or not need to have as much level of evidence to support it versus a high-risk device. But we know ultimately orphan devices can be low-risk or they can be high-risk depending on the needs. So again, the proportionality doesn't really work when you may only have limited number of devices that are placed on the market. We'll talk a little bit about that in detail through today. And again, regardless of your manufacturer size or your annual device sales volume, all manufacturers have to meet those applicable requirements. We're not allowed or permitted to say, well, they only sell 3 devices a year. Let's strike out these obligations here. They don't need to do those. No, it is literally whether you sell 1 device or a million devices. The legislation doesn't allow for that proportionality or consideration. but it does allow for proportionality on interpretation, which, as I said, we'll get to. I don't want to bore you with the law and the legal framework, but there are some key points that we need to consider in the context of orphan and pediatric devices. And one of those is the need or the legal requirement for manufacturers to really base their clinical evaluation or to put their argument forward on a device based on clinical data, providing sufficient clinical evidence, as you see highlighted in this legislative text. And ultimately, what does that mean by providing sufficient clinical evidence? Well, that's actually a bit of quality and quantity. So evidence needs to be statistically concluded or proportionate. So meaning that statistically valid conclusions can be drawn from that clinical data to make those clinical evidence arguments, but also the quality of data. So sometimes, gathering data from complaints, for example, in the framework or the network can be considered low quality or low consideration, because often they might depict a negative experience or complaint about the device, versus a high randomized control trial where you've got a comparator of two technologies. That would be considered high quality evidence. And what the manufacturer is required to do is really to specify and justify that that clinical evidence is sufficient. It's not actually the notified body's role or responsibility to make the argument on behalf of the manufacturer. It's a notified body's role to really validate or consider whether the manufacturer's justification is appropriate in the context of that device. And what is really helpful for manufacturers is when they tell us the story. So when we understand the background of the device as to why it's an orphan device, why it's used in pediatrics, for example, that is something that really helps us to understand the technology, understand where its intention or use is to be used, and even what your expected sales volume might be, or the use of that device in the clinical setting. And again, the proportionality then allows us to apply the legal framework in a proportional and pragmatic way as well. So providing or proving sufficient clinical evidence, as I mentioned earlier, is a little bit of a basis on kind of varying factors. And I've tried to really illustrate this through some petrol gauges that you see, or fuel gauges that you see on the screen. So something that is low risk, for example, might not need as much clinical data. There's even an exception in some cases where no clinical data may be required. If you take, for example, a sterilizer or a medical device fridge, those are things that perhaps, if you take the context of a fridge, what's important in a fridge from a clinical perspective, that it's the ability to maintain a temperature. And that can be proven in a bench or a lab setting. It doesn't necessarily need clinical data. Then if you look on the other side of the spectrum, things like orthopedic implants, for example, those would be considered high-risk devices, or something used in the cardiovascular system or neurological system. That's a long-term implant. That might be considered a high-risk device under the classification system. And so that's important, because then the level of evidence that's needed to support that needs to be higher in both quality and quantity in terms of sufficient data. Things like indirect clinical benefit and direct clinical benefit. My background's in cardiology, and we often think about stents or coronary stents and how they're used to open up the artery, particularly for people with angina or maybe experiencing a heart attack. There are tools that may be used in order to get that device to that location, or to get that stent to the location, such as a stent or a balloon. Now, they would perhaps have what could be argued as an indirect clinical benefit, because the direct clinical benefit comes from the stent. But in our regulatory system, because all of those devices and accessories touch the heart, the central cardiovascular system, they then get up classified. And so we have to consider, even though they're class 3, there's an indirect clinical benefit here. So we have to be proportionate, not only on the device's clinical benefit, but actually the intended use and the duration of which that has contact, and take those into consideration. And of course, the ability to gather clinical data also presents obstacles for you as a manufacturer, or even as a clinician. And sometimes our devices have technical standards as well, and those technical standards can be used, again, to formulate or show evidence of conformity. And again, if we know something is designed in a specific way and meets a standard, that ultimately means that we know there's a demonstrable element of safety and confidence in that safety and performance that can be expected. Things that have longer lifetimes, so things that are placed into our body for many, many years, might require a lot higher quality of evidence. And that's the proportionality that we see. And I'm sure Tom will talk about this today, but the European Commission decided to try and address this through guidance. Because as I mentioned earlier, the legislation itself is quite limited. The ability to use this guidance to really try and bring some proportionality into the situation. And this allows the use of expert panels to designate something as an orphan device and to get an opinion or a response as to what is sufficient clinical data in the context of these. It also gives some obligations to the notified body of what they need to consider and how to apply that proportionality of clinical data. Um, Even though, as I mentioned, within our requirements of the legislation, we have something called general safety and performance requirements, and these still need to be met for orphan devices. They're called GSPRs, and again, what we need to make sure is that the proportionality for some of those GSPRs to be met, there is needed to be sometimes technical data and sometimes clinical data. And again, we need to ensure that the proportionality is applied. And the definition of an orphan device of less than 12,000 patients a year in the EU is an example of how that can be considered and how that proportionality needs to be taken into account. And we need to balance that proportionality with feasibility. So it's all good saying, we can give you a device to market, but your post-market clinical follow-up study needs to have 200 patients. But the reality is, if there are only 5 patients with that rare condition in the EU, then the feasibility of that post-market clinical follow-up is never going to be achieved. So notified bodies need to consider that in the context of how they authorize and push or grant the certificates for these devices. Of course, it's important that, we have to balance that scientific uncertainty, ensuring that the level of evidence is proportionality or is proportionate with what can be considered in preclinical data. And we don't want to lose patient safety or public trust with the CE marking system as well. That's a really valid point to say that, it's built on a known reputation, and we don't want to damage that. We want to make sure ultimately that, devices are available, but they are available knowing that they have a good safety and performance or ability to demonstrate the safety and performance of those devices. Sometimes the guidance refers to an expected clinical benefit. So again, what we are needed to do as a notified body is really to critically evaluate the data that is presented and how that story is told by a manufacturer. And sometimes there can be limitations in that pre-market data. As I mentioned earlier, it's all good that you've got 5 patients in the EU with this clinical condition, but the reality is you're not ever going to be able to get sufficient pre-market data that is statistically valid to be able to conclude the safety and performance of that device. So ultimately, that's about making sure that expectations and proportionality on the data that's presented is appropriate. And it requires some evaluation to obviously make sure that data is free from bias, etc. We need to ensure, obviously, ultimately, the benefit risk profile of that device is favorable, that truly that the benefits do outweigh those risks. What we can't do as a notified body, of course, is accept the orphan status as a reason for doing less work or less scrutiny. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have the ability to strike out certain clauses in that regulation to say, oh, we're not going to do this one, or we're not going to do that one, or we're not going to consider, or we'll lower the bar on this level of evidence because maybe it's a situation that, but if it doesn't paint the whole scientific picture for us, it's important to consider that. Again, we have a legal requirement in the legislation to think about what post-market clinical follow-up looks like. And again, the legislation still calls out for a detailed plan. Now, that plan still needs to be detailed, even if it is for an orphan device, because ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, even if you're only planning to collect data from 5 patients a year in the post-market phase, there still needs to be a structure to how you collect that and a protocol to, again, ensure that that data is being collected, that ultimately feeds back into the system or your clinical evaluation of the confidence behind the safety and performance of that device. And what we can't obviously ignore is any unresolved safety or performance uncertainties. There are some big issues that need to be addressed. We need to get confidence from the manufacturer that they are not, in fact, a safety or performance uncertainty or concern. One thing that notified bodies do have, of course, is something that's called certificates with conditions. And under the legislation, there is the ability for us to provide a certificate with a condition, meaning that we can have some activities agreed. It might mean that as a notified body, we would expect to have maybe some post-market surveillance reporting back to us, such as post-market clinical follow-up, perhaps on a more frequent basis, or when a device is used, that you gather that data so that, again, we can continue to confirm and verify to our authorities who designate us that we're showing control on the release of these devices, but ultimately ensuring that patients aren't getting harmed from what is sometimes perceived as expected clinical benefit based on bench testing, right in the absence of clinical data. There's some acknowledged realities as well. The fact that we know that there are smaller patient populations with these types of devices, there are often ethical or practical limits on clinical investigations, particularly in the pediatric space. And we know as well that, the disproportionate cost that considered for against sales volume, it's important. And I think this is one of the problems we have in the system, is that, the ability to get an MDR certificate, not just through the notified body costs for that, but ultimately to bring your system or your quality management system into play under the legislation, all adds cost. And when that is not reimbursed in our ecosystem proportionately, then that leads to problems and ultimately leads to a very low appetite for manufacturers to actually launching devices on the market. And there are some provisions that are being put forward in the future that may see this. There are also some other options that exist in the legislation, something called derogation, where a manufacturer doesn't need to come to a notified body, they can apply to the competent authorities. But we have this orphan guidance. We're starting to see more and more authorities say, use the orphan device pathway. So what does proportionality look like in practice? Well, that's about, us being proportional in terms of relying on that bench testing and lab testing data, rather than you going out to have to collect clinical data from patients. And again, using that data to clearly articulate what the expected clinical benefit is, and then ensuring that there's some mechanism in post-market surveillance or post-market clinical follow-up to prove that point. But again, it's about making sure that any residual uncertainty is, of course, controlled and monitored. And that's something that our authorities who designate us as a notified body expect to see on these devices. So PMCF is really important when it comes to orphan devices, because ultimately, if we're accepting pre-market limitations, there must be some ability to answer those questions in post-market. But again, that needs to be done in proportionality. So again, ensuring that where there are limitations, maybe because the patient population is in single digits, that expectations aren't there that double digits data is collected in the post-market. So again, conversations with the notified body, but also the ability to get that scientific advice from the expert panels now, which I'm sure Tom will talk about, is a great option to consider. Again, realistic timelines in that post-market phase as well, and the use of registries. Again, I am starting to get more contacts from medical societies who are looking to capture data from the use of devices in very unusual situations, such as orphan or pediatric indications, to try and gather that body of evidence. Also, things like prospective PMCF investigations. Again, reality is that if you can't do a clinical investigation pre-market, the reality is post-market that might be difficult. But the use of real-world clinical data can come in many forms. And again, notified bodies need to be considerate and proportionate in terms of their expectations there. The reality is that, small numbers and slow data accrual are expected. But sometimes the word difficult is often used when manufacturers try to justify not doing post-market clinical follow-up activities. But actually what we're looking for is something that's better defined to suit the device and the patient population for which that data can be collected. But the reality is, when those PMCF commitments are in play, we all have an obligation. You as a manufacturer have an obligation to report back to us that information, and we have an obligation as notified bodies to our designated authorities that we're acting responsibly as an acting authority for them. And therefore, it's important that if PMCF commitments are not followed through, that action will need to be taken by notified bodies. What I will say is that structured dialogue is a great opportunity for you as a manufacturer to come and have a discussion with a notified body, as well as go to the expert panels. We can have those conversations before you apply to consider whether you are in fact an orphan device. And if you are thinking about applying, have more conversations around what are our expectations on the clinical evidence. In conjunction with, if the expert panels are providing an opinion, we consider that within the conformity assessment and to ensure that that is met as well. But of course, we have to respect our independence and impartiality. We are an authority in terms of issuing certificates, and so we can't provide solutions, but what we can do is provide commentary on your proposals. And again, the expert panel advice, again, great for getting that validation of orphan status and advice on clinical data sufficiency and uncertainty. And I think it's important to say that, we as notified bodies need to consider that panel advice carefully, explain and justify any divergence if appropriate. So I just want to say thank you again for this opportunity to come and present. Thank you. I think I'm handing over to Tom.
Thank you, Rich. I'll just present my screen. Apologies. Hopefully you can all see the screen now. And thank you, Annalene, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you, and it's lovely to see some familiar names amongst the attendee list. In this short talk, I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the main activities for regulation, I guess acknowledging that many of you won't have that much regulatory experience. And then later in the talk, we'll focus in on what has changed in recent years. Rich has mentioned the guidance that was published in 2024, and there are a number of changes possibly coming to the regulation that we'll explain as well. So just to show you the agenda, we'll explain just briefly who are the regulators for medical devices in Europe, because we have a quite complicated system. We'll then focus in on regulation as part of translational development. What are the things, especially at early stages of development, that you need to think about and plan? And then we'll talk about some of the recent developments and proposals to change the medical device regulation. So firstly, to explain who are responsible for the regulation of devices, we'll go into a little bit more detail on national authorities and notified bodies. Essentially, national authorities look after trials of medical devices and issues in the post-market. And as Rich was explaining, notified bodies have the very important job of applying the CE mark, or allowing devices to go to market. The European Commission has a predominantly policy-oriented role, and they chaired a regulatory working group that we'll show you in a minute. And a new addition with the medical device regulation when it came into effect in 2021 was the addition of expert panels, and this was taken over by the European Medicines Agency in 2022. They'll have some specific jobs for orphan devices, and we'll explain that also. So this is just to break down manufacturers. When you read the medical device regulation, are given most of the responsibilities. So a lot of the requirements apply to manufacturers. When you want to do a clinical investigation or a clinical study, you have to get approval from the national competent authority of each country where you want to run your study, and from an ethics committee. Then once you have done your studies, you want to apply to get your CE mark. Notified bodies are required for all of the risk classes from 2A, 2B, and 3. If you're a class 1 device, you can proceed to market without a notified body assessment. One other thing to note is that once you get your CE mark, that's just your market enablement. It doesn't necessarily mean that anyone is going to buy your product. So reimbursement, procurement, health technology assessment, these are all separate things to regulation, and there is some separate EU law, but also quite a lot of national approaches that apply to how medical devices are actually bought and paid for. This is a very busy organogram, and I won't go through the full detail of it, but when we think about where guidance or policy comes from in our system, you'll see the Medical Device Coordination Group in the middle here is the most important part for the medical device regulation. The European Commission chaired this, and it's attended by all of the member states. They've been meeting over the last couple of days, and they're responsible for preparing guidance to implement the medical device regulation. There are lots of other actors, as you can see. We won't go through them all. At the moment, there is a proposal to change the law. So the legislative bodies, the European Commission, the Council, and the Parliament are all actively looking at changes to the regulation. So how are medical devices regulated in Europe? Rich talked a lot about CE marking, which is the typical pathway that most products proceed through. There are some other ways that a device can get to a patient. Derogations is when you have an exceptional approval. So instead of a notified body, a national authority comes in on an exceptional basis and says the product can be made available. This has been a possible avenue for some of the disappearing devices that we saw affecting orphan devices over the past years. It is also possible, as well as a national derogation, to get an EU-wide derogation. And this is something that we may see more of in the future. And I know that the European Medicine Agency expert panels have been supporting an EU derogation. So this is an exceptional measure that can particularly help with the disappearing or devices being withdrawn phenomenon that we've seen. And just finally, in-house devices, there are specific rules in Article 5 of the MDR that allow you to manufacture and use a medical device within a healthcare facility. So this could be used for simple things like splints or 3D printed molded cups and things like that. So that's another pathway just to be aware of, depending on whatever products you might be working on. These are the classification rules, and you need to understand this because it has important implications for who might be overseeing your device. So if you're class 1, you don't have to apply to a notified body. And if you're class 2A, 2B, or 3, there are different requirements that can apply under the MDR. When we talk of orphan devices, the differences between 2A and 2B are not hugely different because you often have just one product. And 2A and 2B is based on different sampling. If you have a whole range of products, not all are assessed, just a representative sample. And for class 3 devices, especially implantable ones, you may be required to undergo an external EMA expert panel opinion. So to understand the risk class rules, you have to go through Annex 8, and this will help you to figure out which risk class applies. So what do notified bodies do? They have a lot of different requirements under the MDR. So there's a lot of tasks that they have. Just breaking it down, and Rich explained this very well, you can have a structured dialogue. So as you're submitting to the notified body, you can have an interaction to make sure expectations are clear. There is a validation step taken by the notified body. This can sometimes take some months to make sure all of the documents are presented that are necessary. And then depending on your conformity assessment, there will be technical document assessments, an audit of your quality management system. There'll often be an on-site audit undertaken. And for some types of conformity routes, although it's uncommon, the notified body might arrange for testing of the product. Once you proceed through your conformity assessment, you have your CE mark, and then there are post-market requirements where you'll also have interactions with the notified body. When you get your CE certificate, that lasts for 5 years, then you have to have a recertification assessment. And with the current proposal to change MDR, there's a suggestion to remove this 5-year reassessment and only allow devices to be reassessed in exceptional cases. So in the next part, we'll think about translational development. And in the forthcoming slides, we'll think about a device as it goes through some of the early stages of its device lifecycle. What you can see here are the technology, clinical, regulatory, and business strategies. So this is very much how the Gates framework works that Annelien would have explained in the previous webinar. These are the 4 vital strategies that every technology developer needs. When you're at the very early stage of concept to prototype, you're looking to figure out, can we build this? Might it work? You haven't gone into formal product development yet, but you can sometimes start to think about things that you might write down now that may help your regulatory compliance later. So you might just start to have some early thoughts on what kind of clinical development. Do we need a pre-market clinical study, or might we be able to proceed to market without one? You probably won't have a quality management system or internal processes and procedures, but you might be starting to prepare some control documents, and that can help you later. And you probably won't have a full design file yet, but you may be starting to prepare component lists or do some bench testing. So thinking about how much of this you might be able to write down and utilize later is important. A big part of early product development is design verification and validation. So you have to break down all of your components. You have to think of the user needs. You have to map your design inputs. and your design outputs, and then you have to verify all of the different outputs and then validate the overall device. So if you have a single device with 100 components, you verify each component, and then you validate that the overall product is designed as intended. Once you make the decision that you have a prototype that's worthy of further development, this is really when you get into formal product development, and you're going to have to start thinking about regulatory compliance in a more organized way. So when you move from design freeze into further preclinical development, you'll be mapping out what are the standards that apply to my device, because this will inform some of your bench testing or maybe your toxicology or biocompatibility test requirements. So you'll have to map these out and plan your testing strategy. You'll be starting to move from ideas about a clinical development plan to actually preparing for whatever clinical studies are necessary. And you will start to integrate aspects of your quality management system. So you'll be starting to think about things like risk management, preparing documents either for a clinical investigation step or for your notified body step. And this is when things really change. And often you're moving from development in an academic setting to maybe a spin-out type company. So things are starting to become more formal. When you get to the clinical investigation stage, you will have to apply to the authority and ethics, as we mentioned, and they have standard document requirements. So in practice, you often have to have a risk management file prepared. The authorities will often look at aspects of your design file. You'll have to have a protocol and informed consent document, and you have to get all of these submissions ready. Preparing for a clinical study is a multi-organizational approach where you might have the hospital site, perhaps a university or the spin-out company, data protection officers. Lots of different people come together to make sure that everything is prepared. So what is currently happening to the regulation with orphan devices? Rich mentioned this guidance that was published in 2024. This was the first guidance for orphan devices. And to be an orphan device, the criteria are listed here. It has to be used in not more than 12,000 patients within the EU per year. There have to be limited alternatives and an expected clinical benefit. The EMA ran a pilot over the last year where they provided 14 designations and said formally that you are an orphan device. Notified bodies have also been giving devices an orphan status for the purpose of their conformity assessment. So we probably have much more than 14 devices that have been considered orphan over the past year. When you read through the guidance, it will show you that more limited clinical data is possible. So this has been recognized by regulators, and they also have an annex that explains extrapolation. So if you have a stent that's been used in adults, you may be able to extrapolate some of that outcome data to support your application for an orphan use. And there is also some wording in the guidance about the use of off-label data with orphan devices, because many devices used in rare treatments, for example, in cardiology, 2/3 of the devices used for pediatrics will be the off-label use of devices intended for adults. So this is an important thing that we have to accommodate. There's been a huge amount of policy discussion over the past years on the MDR, and there's a lot of political attention currently. A revised proposal was published by the European Commission on the 16th of December, and we'll explain a couple of things as to what's in that. Firstly, they're planning to take the definition of orphan devices that's in that MDCG guidance and place it into the MDR. They have a number of new things that were not mentioned in the guidance, and this is to look for priority and rolling reviews with notified bodies, where you could submit things after you send your initial application. An important change that's proposed is that if you are a legacy device approved under the previous directives and you get an orphan designation from the EMA expert panels, you could then be grandfathered, and it would be possible to be available under MDR under certain conditions. For example, if there's no change to the device. So this is an important one to protect the disappearing device phenomenon we saw in recent years. There can also be a 50% fee reduction with notified bodies, but how that will work in practice, we have yet to figure out because this will likely put up fees elsewhere. And there will be some niche devices. For example, in pediatrics, there will be a lot of small-sized catheters or accessories for dialysis for pediatrics, which would fall outside of the 12,000 threshold. So from Biomedical Alliance, representing clinical societies, we are recommending that we should also include a separate definition of pediatric devices in addition to orphan devices to try and accommodate these types of technologies. And finally, then, with the changes to the MDR, it puts an emphasis on expert panels to support clinical development strategy for orphan device developers and help them to figure out that balance that Rich was talking about what's appropriate for pre-market clinical evidence and post-market clinical evidence to try and support these developers. So a couple of concluding remarks. I won't go through all of the detail in this slide, but even with the simplification changes coming to MDR, we still have a very different system to the medicine system. So our evidence standard is somewhat more nebulous, safety and performance, and this is because we have to accommodate heart valves, medical equipment, and wheelchairs all under the one legal framework. The technical documentation can be somewhat variable depending on what authority you go to for your study or what notified body you go to for CE marking. So we have a quite distinct system from the medicines framework, and helping to get better evidence clarity for developers, I think, is a really important thing that we have to do more work on. You've already seen the Gates framework, I'd imagine, but this is a helpful tool that you can use to try and map out your strategies. What I would say is when you look at this cogwheel here, you'll see that it's not linear. So you might find that you test your prototype and it doesn't work as you intended. So you might have to go back and revise it. And as you proceed through the life cycle steps, this is something that can often happen. But it's really important to think of these 4 strategies because you have to have a clear plan for them in order to translate. And finally, your experience, especially in the orphan world when developing technologies, you are often in very small micro-organizations. So your experience of development is very different to big medtech, where they have a huge amount of experience and documents and testing that they can often utilize when introducing new products. When you're starting as an orphan developer or a new device developer, you're often starting from scratch. You have limited resources, time, and funding. And it's vitally important that you reach out and get support from the best people at the appropriate time. Because none of these things are a solo run or a one-person show. They need a lot of multidisciplinary and cross-organizational support. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you very much. I guess it's maybe my job to introduce Brian. You're very welcome, Brian. You might just put me to Brian.
There you go. Thanks very much, Tom. So my name is Brian Bailey. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Harmony Medical. And we're developing a sheath which will be the first dedicated stabilization system for hybrid and structural heart procedures. And it's one of the devices that's going to be working its way through this pediatric and orphan framework over the coming years. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes is to give you a device developer's view of where this pathway is today, what the EU is good at, what the FDA is good at, and a few practical tips that you can take with you on your journeys. So what I'll cover today, if I can move on, there we go. I've broken it down into 8 blocks. I'm going to go through this, give you a bit of a feeling for what's happening on the ground, as it were, because Tom and Rich have covered the more technical side, and I'll try and give you more the commercial side of what's going on. So I'll try and keep it brief, and so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So first, to give a bit of context, and most people here know this, but I think it's always useful to outline it again. Children are not small adults. When you look at a neonate, their head it's 4 times their body is 4 times the size of their head. By the time they're 5, it's 6 times the size of their head. When you get to adult, it's 7.5 times. But what that means is throughout the body, all these changes are happening. And the consequences for device makers with the changing anatomy and physiology, and And long-term durability, which is very important, is really challenging, because this is a kind of killer that's from a commercial point of view. Because if you're trying to make products that you can prove work in a neonate until they're an adult, it's very difficult to do that if you're trying to make money at the same time. So if you take one thing from this, the threshold in adults and children trial designs do not transfer. And what's the clinical reality at the moment? And Tom touched on this really well. Off-label use. And to his point, there was an FDA study, now it's going back a few years, I think it was around 2010 or 11, and they said 63% of devices used in pediatrics were off-label, which is an incredible figure, really. So what this does in the practical sense is that this shifts the liability from the manufacturer to the doctor or the institution. It also creates an evidence gap because there's no sponsored coordinating data. So again, we've Tom and Rich have covered much of this. What's changed with MDR? Effectively, when we changed to MDR in 2021, there was no carve out for pediatric or orphan devices. The net effect was those small volume devices, including a number of long, well-established pediatric devices, came under economic pressure. So the bottleneck made it harder, not easier, to bring new pediatric devices to market. Now that is being corrected now with the new guidance. So when we're talking about the new guidance, this really helps us because the clinical requirements are more proportionate. What that means is we don't need complex randomized controlled trials always. There's a conditional route to CE marking, I think is probably the simplest way to put it. It's a real improvement, but I do have two caveats. Firstly, it's only a guidance document and not legislation. And there still seems to be some confusion over how to implement it between the notified bodies. So in practice, predictability is still an issue. Now, when you go to the FDA, it's a much more mature toolkit. Even the way they define a humanitarian use device. In the US, it's 8,000. In the EU, it's 12,000. And when you're talking about humanitarian device exemption, they only ask for probable benefit, not full effectiveness. So what that means, the burden of proof, I wouldn't say is reduced, but it is different and it is easier. It's also a coherent toolkit. There's FDA-funded centers that give non-dilutive grants, regulatory advisory and mentoring, breakthrough device designation, all this kind of stuff, which gets you to first in human without a full IDE. It's a coherent, certain toolkit. And to give you an example of this is quite a well-known example. Now, this goes back to 2019, and I use this because I think it's interesting that this was a device that was approved under MDD, I think in 2011. And the FDA were really, really keen to start getting more devices in approved, and they weren't off-label, so they wouldn't be off-label. So this device was almost chased by the FDA to get into market. And they brought it through the process and got it into market. And it turns out to have been a huge commercial success in the US as well. What's interesting about that is that would not happen now. We wouldn't go from MDD to FDA. It would almost certainly be the other way around. And that's what we're going to do with our product. We will be going FDA first. I mean, on paper, the EU is our home market. But the FDA pediatric pathway is more structured still and better resourced. So we have a clearer path to the clinical evidence that were required. The dedicated funding and the fact they're the largest single market, gives us the commercial support to go through this process. Going EU first sounds very patriotic, but the FDA first is a more logical solution. So to give you a couple of practical tips, and I think Tom touched on this, understand the full scope at the start. You need to fund it all the way through. Stop-start funding, it really doesn't help. You end up making mistakes, making changes. Try and get it funded all the way through from the start. Pick the right partners. Check the full scope is covered. Be working with the right people. Be comfortable working with the right people, whether it's your notified body, your regulatory advisors, your manufacturing partners, whatever it is. Really, really critically, design inputs properly. As Tom said, start your design file, your QMS, your risk management file early. Because this will be what you look back at more than anything else, is your risk management file. You'll be looking at that with the regulators more than nearly anything else. Communicate clearly with the regulators. They're great to deal with. Don't be afraid of them. Talk to them. They will give you feedback. They won't tell you what to do, but they will give you feedback. So here's a couple of the ideas, places you can get help in Europe, and you should use them. Particularly that last one, if you're going US, the QSub program, talking to people, they will help you out. So this is just the wrap up. So the gap is structural. There's small markets, high evidence cost, and until recently, there's no EU specific flexibilities. Supports for, the bar was raised without raising supports. The off-label use is a symptom. It really isn't the solution. We need to get rid of it insofar as we can. Have your full scope before you, as early as you can, and the right partners, and use the help that's out there. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Rich, for talking us through the regulatory system and the gaps and challenges that we might see. We've already had some questions in the chat, so let's go through those, and then I have some further questions. And the first question, and in between that we're starting to answer some questions, feel free for all of the participants for today to also put further questions in the chat, of course. The first question that we've received is, we are finding an increasing number of discontinuation of orphan medical devices in recent years since the new MDR application. Is there currently any pathway in the EU to safeguard and maintain the MDR certification of previously available devices or reduction of cost for post-market surveillance, or any other incentive that would help medtech companies maintain existing products without an increased cost? Is there any one of you that wants to take that first question?
Maybe I could start, maybe, and then others could add in. What are the incentives currently? It's very different to the medicines world, where there can be changes to exclusivity or vouchers or things that regulators can do to give something of value to a developer to incentivize them to make one of these devices. We don't have those kind of incentives built in yet. Under the current framework, how could you protect a device that's at risk of disappearing? From the regulatory system, the answer would be that there's the Medical Devices Shortages Steering Group. This was brought in as part of the post-COVID measures, and there are groups assigned, but it's a quite closed working group. So as stakeholders, we don't have an opportunity to go and meet or engage with them very much. There is the derogation that I mentioned, but one of the challenges when a device may disappear is that I tend to hear about it after clinicians have heard about it, after the company has made the decision. And regulators cannot, bring a production line back to life. So what we have to do is figure out when a product is at risk of being withdrawn. So let's say if we know the certificate is going to run out, at X future date, and the company either is not prepared or does not have the financial means, or for whatever reason is not going to seek further marketing. I think we have a real opportunity to do better with EU-wide derogations. So I was very happy to hear that some regulators are working on another EU-wide derogation. With the new legislative proposals, there will be, the grandfathering for these legacy orphan devices could be a really important thing. So if you get that designation as an orphan device, and if you were certified under the directives, you could stay on the market. So if we have a sensible way to apply that, whenever that does come through as legislation, that could be a useful thing. But we don't have the same incentives that the medicines world would have.
Maybe, Annalena, if I could just add there as well, I think to Tom's point, it really is about making sure that communication happens much earlier than later. As to Tom's point, even a notified body can't resurrect the manufacturing line either. So it is about sort of making sure that you have conversations with your notified body as well. There are alternative notified bodies as well. So if you're facing challenges with one notified body, having a conversation with another might find that you might have a difference of opinion, and there might be a difference in price as well, etc. To keep that on the market. So it is difficult. I think notified bodies do get a little bit of a sort of hammering on this, because we are expected to apply the full force of the legislation. We're not, as I mentioned in my presentation, we're not allowed to really say, oh, for this device, we're going to not do that in the post-market phase. If the legal obligation's there, it's there. But there are often mechanisms that notified bodies could consider in terms of those conversations about, proportionality of cost, for example. Some notified bodies may be willing to consider that in their approach. Ultimately, it's about talking. But to Tom's point, the other mechanisms need to be considered as well, such as contacting the medical device shortages system and scheme that is out there, derogation consideration as well, and speaking to the competent authorities to get that derogation in place before it's too.
And on that, I think talking to people is the key thing there. You have to be talking to the people, whether it's the competent authority, whether whoever it is, and your notified body, and have a good relationship. Without that, once the relationship is gone and you can't have a conversation with them, you're in trouble. And we all are, because those products will just disappear.
Thank you. A second question has come in, and that is it expected to have a new version of the MDR and orphan medical device regulations approved in the EU soon? And what are the next steps in this?
Do you want me to take that one, Tom, or
You want to start, Rich? Yeah.
Okay. So, I think it is fair to say that the medical device regulation, when it was first launched back in 2021, the pendulum swung in a very conservative way. And I think that's fair. I think we all say that there are some things within the legislation that perhaps are a little bit too conservative, but we shouldn't forget what the fundamental reason for that change was. And that was more transparency to patients, increased surveillance, and patient safety. The reality of implementing that regulation now has come to considerations, and orphan devices has probably been one of the casualties of that MDR situation. So the reality is now, under the MDR 2.0, that's currently in a proposal form. So what's been proposed by the Commission is very much in the early days, where there'll be lots of discussions about what can potentially change. And I think one of the messages that everybody's trying to get into the regulation is the proportionality, the ability to ensure that proportionality is appropriate. And one thing that is considered in there is some mechanisms in place. So one of the things that is proposed, for example, is orphan devices being actually in the legislative framework, so being given consideration for those devices, versus at the moment, as you heard Tom say, it's guidance, and guidance is never legally binding. If it's in legislative framework, means that there has to be some obligations or some consideration for those devices. What those actually will entail in the future, nobody really knows, because it will be many, many discussions between member states, the Commission, members of the European Parliament, patient groups, etc. One of the other mechanisms that is proposed in MDR 2.0 is the ability for notified bodies to discount for certain sized manufacturers. So again, we know that sometimes orphan devices might be coming from maybe small enterprises where the amount of people or revenue is very small. Therefore, there is some proposals that there should be discounts in that legislation to allow for small companies to be able to continue to place products on the market. I think what we shouldn't lose sight of is that the proportionality of a certificate fee with a notified body, when you've got to still meet the other obligations, as rightly put earlier with the post-market obligations, those are costs that all add up. And we need to make sure that if cost is to be applied, that there is fairness across the system. So it's cheaper for smaller manufacturers to be able to implement QMS systems. The obligations of them in the post-market surveillance are appropriate as well. So there's lots that are that is potentially coming. What actually comes in the final text? Well, we'll hopefully find out in the next few years. But Tom, I don't know if you want to
Maybe a short addition to this question. So that means that the revised MDR is due in 2027, 2028, 2029.
The official estimate from the Commission is Q2 2027. I think that they're trying their best to accelerate the negotiation. It's all a negotiation now between Commission, Council, and Parliament. So we'll have greater clarity. You know, the formal report from the Parliament or report from Council, we'll see that in the next month or two. And that'll give us the position of the three institutions. And that might tell us then if they're on a similar page or not. But we should have a reasonable sense by the end of this year. In theory, it should be wrapped up by Q2 of next year. They do plan a transition period. So for some things, they might say this comes into effect after 12 months or after whatever. That's yet to be figured out. But one thing I would say is that you can apply today for a designation as an orphan device. So you could get that done with the EMA. And if these legal changes come in and grandfathering is allowed, then you would be able to, apply that quite quickly. So you could get your designation as an orphan device today. You can apply and get the advice processes today. So those things can happen right now. And the designation might be useful if you're a legacy device and the legal changes go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question also that I've received via email, and that is maybe directed to Brian. So one of the issues currently, which you've also pointed towards, is that the current orphan device guidance is not legally binding and has not really a super precision on what you actually have to do. Is it actually something like that would help you as a developer to say a sort of decision tree mechanism to say, for instance, in the aspect of clinical device gathering, randomized clinical trial is not always feasible, but in this case, you would follow this scenario, or in this case, you would follow this scenario. Would that be something that you would, as a device developer, be looking for, or?
Absolutely. The biggest difference between dealing with the FDA and looking at CE certification is the certainty in the pathway. That's this in one word, it's certainty. When you deal with the FDA, they're not your friend, but they're very easy to deal with. They will come back to you and they will give you answers. And you suggest this is the pathway we think is sensible, and they will say, okay, yeah, or no, or they're pretty transparent to deal with. I'm not saying they're perfect. So I think more clarity and I think, and this is not really a conversation for here, but the European market is very different as well. When you bring a device into the market, when you're trying to sell it in the EU, I mean, the difference in price between the US and the EU is enormous. The US pay a much higher premium for products that have benefit, where in the EU we won't. Now, this is not a conversation for here, but that's when you're running a commercial organization, that's the reality of what you're trying to do. You've got to make sure make sure the books balance, make sure there's profit made for shareholders, make sure everybody wins. So clarity and consistency would be the two are the things. Clarity, consistency, and certainty. At least there you know what you have to do.
Thank you very much. We are 1 minute before the end. There is still a question on the idea of a critical device list that I'm hoping that you will help me answer via email. But given the fact that it's 1 minute before the hour and we promised to be done at 6 o'clock here, and I think 7 o'clock for all of our speakers today, 5 o'clock for all of our speakers today, I would again like to thank all of our speakers today, Brian, Tom, and Rich. And most importantly, I want to thank our entire audience on behalf of the 3 EU for Health co-funded projects, which are Orphan Advocates, I4Kids and the Decode project. And thank you for attending this webinar. And we'll have after the summer a third webinar on clinical development of orphan, pediatric, and orphan devices. And we hope that many of you will be back for that last part of the series. And with that, thank you again. It's 6 o'clock sharp, and I wish all of you a beautiful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.